2018. In 2023, Nicola became a counsellor, later assumed the role of membership officer, and this year took over as chair of the awards committee. So a very active member of ASA, volunteering lots of time there. She also helped with ASA's National Science Week event and is actively involved in revising ASA's constitution. Nicola also enjoys gardening, concert going and spending time with her dog and cat. So, ladies and gentlemen, all about Louise Webster. Who is she? What did she do? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Nicola to tell us all about it.
Thank you. Betty Louise Webster was born on the 20th of May 1941 in Adelaide. Her parents were Donald Edwin Webster and Vera Elizabeth Webster nee Mageary, and her brothers were Edwin Hugh and Ashley Donald. Donald and Vera Elizabeth were married at All Souls Church, St Peters, South Australia, on the 17th of December 1938. In the advertiser for Monday, 19th of December, on page 6, there is a report and photo of the wedding with an exquisitely detailed description of the bride's dress, bridesmaids' dresses, and the dresses and hats worn by the mothers of the bride and groom. Louise's eldest brother, Edwin, was born the following year, and her younger brother, Ashley Donald, in 1943. And as I said, Louise was born on the 20th of May, 1941. Although she was always called Louise, she was christened Betty Louise after her mother, who also preferred to be called Betty rather than Vera or Elizabeth. On her mother's side, Louise had German, English, and Irish ancestors. Her maternal great-grandmother was Clara Amelie Koppen, and Clara's mother had emigrated from Hamburg and her father from Prussia. They met and married in Adelaide. Louise's maternal great-grandfather's parents, Thomas Henderson and Elizabeth Hall, both came from England, and they too met and married in Adelaide. At one time, they owned the Vine Inn on Glen Osmond Road. Louise's maternal grandfather, Frank William Ashley Mageary, was of English and Irish extraction. Louise's father, Donald, was born and brought up in Hobart, Tasmania, the youngest son of Edwin Herbert and Edith Maud Webster. Edwin and his elder brother Charles worked for the family firm of A.G. Webster and Sons Limited, wool and grain merchants. A.G. Webster Limited is the fourth oldest company in Australia and dates back to 1831. Alexander Webster, Donald's grandfather, ran the grain and wool business from 1856. It later diversified into broadacre farming, forestry, vegetables, rural supplies, transport, and machinery. In the 1990s, Webster pioneered the Australian walnut industry and today represents more than 90% of local production from orchards in Swansea and the Murrumbidgee. In the company, Donald's father Edwin was responsible for the marketing of wool and played a significant role in exporting Tasmanian apples. He was an enthusiastic yachtsman and first-class helmsman and helped to develop the Derwent-class yacht. The eldest of Louise's parental uncles, Hugh, did not join the family firm, but instead he studied physics and became a prominent and distinguished physicist, working at the University of Queensland from 1937 to 1970 as a lecturer in biophysics, associate professor of radiation physics, and finally a professor of physics. In the 1959 New Year's Honours List, he was made a Companion of the Order of St Michael and St George for services to the federal government. Her father, Donald, shared his own father's love of the sea and became a cadet midshipman in 1926. In the early 1930s, he studied for an engineering degree at the University of Tasmania, subsequently working for a General Electric company in England. In 1937, Donald returned to Australia and to Adelaide as a member of the engineering staff of British General Electric. On the 2nd of September 1939, Donald was mobilised for service as a sub-lieutenant, enlisting at Port Adelaide. During his war service, he was promoted to lieutenant and to engineer lieutenant. After demobilisation, Donald rented the parafield caverned aircraft maintenance workshops from the Royal Australian Navy and started an electrical engineering business, Webster Limited. He later moved the business, which made small electric motors, to Elizabeth. After their wedding, Betty and Donald set up home in the Warland Reserve area of Burnside, and then in August 1939, they moved to Martin Avenue, Prospect. Sometime during the war, probably because of Donald's Navy service, they lived in Hunters Hill, Sydney, returning after the war to live in North Adelaide. And in 1954, they bought 3 Smithfield, Walkerville. Louise was 6 years old when she began her schooling at Wilderness, a non-denominational Christian all-girls school, in what was then called the kindergarten class. Originally as the Mrs. Brown School, Wilderness was established in 1884 by Margaret Brown in her own home. In 1893, it moved to the site it now occupies, 30 Hawkers Road, Medindi, and in 1918 changed its name to Wilderness, partly because its grounds resembled the wilderness, and partly because of the biblical connotation of challenge and renewal in the wilderness. Margaret Brown's aim was to provide higher education for girls, to teach them self-reliance, and to equip them for full participation in public life, not forgetting their possible roles as wives and mothers. Louise flourished at Wilderness, a short bike ride away from her home, and participated fully in school life, determined, it seems, to contribute to the utmost of her ability in whatever activity she took part. Her academic record was excellent. Louise gained high marks in her public examinations, particularly in maths, physics, and chemistry. In 1958, in her leaving honours year, Louise won the Parents and Friends Prize for the best academic record. She won other prizes too, and in her leaving year, a leaving bursary and the Thornber bursary. Louise joined the debating and litmus clubs. In 1957, she was president of both. She contributed to the school magazine over the years, poems, a prayer, and what could be called a fable or moral tale about 2 ants, one black and one white. Louise, however, was not a student who lived only in her head. Sport was also important to her, and she played in the A teams for both softball and basketball. Her contribution was acknowledged by the captain of the Amaryllis softball team in 1957. In 1958, Louise was head prefect. Music was another interest, and her sister-in-law Judy remembers Louise as a good pianist. In her early years at Wilderness, Louise had done well in all her chosen subjects, but by leaving honours, science had become her focus, and she gained passes in physics, maths 1 and 2, and a credit in chemistry. So it was no surprise then that Louise read for a science degree at the University of Adelaide from 1959 to 61.
Oh, excuse me, Nicola, I just forgot to press record. Oh, you've done it.
No, you must have done it.
Okay, that's fine.
What might have been something of a jolt for Louise, though, was for her to go from an all-girls school to the very male environment of the University of Adelaide physics department. In her physics lectures, she was the only woman. Perhaps having 2 brothers would have helped. Louise's student card shows that she continued to be an excellent student, gaining credits and distinctions in her exams. Her degree of Bachelor of Science was conferred on her on the 12th of May 1962 for the princely sum of 5 guineas. Excuse me. I don't know why Louise then chose to turn her attention to astronomy, but Professor Bart Bok might have had something to do with it. The seeds for a vigorous graduate program in astronomy at the Australian National University were sown by Professor Richard Woolley and brought to fruition by his successor from 1955, Professor Bart Bok. In 1939, Woolley had been appointed the Commonwealth Astronomer for Australia. He resigned in 1955 to become the 11th Astronomer Royal and the director of the Royal Greenwich Observatory. Bart Bok was a Dutch-American astronomer, teacher and lecturer. He is best known for his work on the structure and evolution of the Milky Way, in close collaboration with his wife and fellow astronomer Priscilla Fairfield. Their book, The Milky Way, was widely acclaimed as one of the most successful astronomical books ever published. In the mid-1950s and into the 60s, astronomy was not, for the most part, taught at Australian universities, so there was no ready-made pool of potential scholars in Australia. According to astronomers Hyland and Faulkner, in a paper on the Woolley and Bok directorships at Mount Stromlo, one of Bok's strategies to rectify this situation was to visit Australian universities, giving public lectures on astronomy and talking to 3rd and 4th year undergraduates about the graduate program at Stromlo. Certainly Hyland and Faulkner both embarked on careers in astronomy as a result of meeting Bok at Queensland University. So perhaps Louise also met Bart Bok in her 2nd or 3rd undergraduate year, and as a consequence applied for the graduate program at Mount Stromlo and the scholarship to the ANU. Louise's uncle Hugh, Professor of Physics at Queensland University, would have met Bart Bok on Bok's visit to Brisbane so maybe he gave her further encouragement to move to Mount Stromlo. The photo at the bottom there shows Gavin McQuiston, Alec Clark and Reg Shinkfield. Gavin was president of ASA at the time. Alec was senior vice president and Reg information officer, with Bart Bock on the balustrade at the Society's Marriotteville Observatory in 1965. Professor Bock is the one with his foot on the railing. I think that...
Can I just expand it to full screen? It's something I didn't appreciate. You might have to come down, Joe. I didn't start this right. So I thought this would be a quick fix. Beautiful. All right, thanks, Joe. Yep.
So I think this photo offers or supports my theory, but perhaps Louise did meet Professor Bock and he sparked her interest in astronomy. In 1962, Louise began her Ph.D. on southern planetary nebulae, supervised by Bengt Westerland. As with Bart Bock, Dr. Westerland's work was on the structure of the Milky Way, and he was which was held in high regard. He contributed significantly to studies of star clusters, carbon stars, planetary nebulae, and stellar classification. He is also regarded as an expert on the Magellanic Clouds. Louise made use of Westerland's extensive data on planetary nebulae for her PhD and her paper, The Masses and Galactic Distribution of Southern Planetary Nebulae. In 1967, Louise was awarded her PhD, and her first appointment was as an instructor at the Washburn Observatory, University of Wisconsin. Those are the first 2 pages of her PhD, and you can see her signature there. In 1969, Louise moved to the Royal Greenwich Observatory at Herstmonceux, East Sussex, UK. Here she worked initially as a scientific officer and then as a senior scientific officer. Louise was only the second woman to be appointed to the staff of RGO, Henrietta Swope preceding her. No doubt Sir Richard Woolley, having been knighted in 1963, would have been delighted to have a graduate from the Mount Stromlo programme working for him. You can see the castle at Herstmonceux. There's a map and the Isaac Newton telescope that Louise worked on. You can see just towards the bottom of the map there. We just have a history of black holes on the postcard. The history of the use of the theoretical term black hole began nearly 250 years ago, when in 1783, British clergyman and astronomer John Michell mused on the idea of objects so massive that light could not escape them. He named them black stars, and in his view, black stars would be detected by their gravitational pull on other visible objects. In 1915, Karl Schwarzschild, a German physicist and astronomer, solved Einstein's equations in the theory of general relativity, producing the first mathematical description of gravitationally collapsed stars. These gravitationally collapsed stars put Robert H. Dick, an American physicist, in mind of the black hole of Calcutta, and he used this comparison in 1963 at the first Texas Symposium on relativistic astrophysics. The first time black holes appeared in print was in Anne Ewing's article, Black Holes in Space, for Science newsletter in 1964. 4 years later, John Wheeler, a theoretical physicist at Princeton University, began the popularization of the term by adopting the suggestion of a member of his audience that black hole could be used as shorthand for the rather long-winded name gravitationally completely collapsed objects. While theoretical physicists and astrophysicists were developing mathematical models for black holes, starting with Einstein's general theory of relativity, others, such as Donald Lyndon Bell, were offering theories to explain the incredibly energetic X-rays emitted by quasars. Donald Lyndon Bell worked at Herstmonceux between 1965 and 1971. In 1969, he was the first to propose the idea that the huge amounts of energy coming from quasars could be explained by accretion onto an incredibly large collapsed object. And at the center of galaxies, including the Milky Way, there were these incredibly large collapsed objects, that is, black holes. At the RGO, Louise worked in the Astronomer Royals department, working on both her own programs and collecting data for Sir Richard Woolley and his team, who were investigating binary stars and galactic dynamics, testing and commissioning the new spectrographs and detectors on the Isaac Newton and Yap telescopes at Herstmonceux was also part of this work. It is likely that Louise had a small bedroom in the north attic of the castle. Paul Murdin studied mathematics and physics at the universities of Oxford and Rochester, New York. In 1962, he took an 8-week summer residential course supporting researchers at the RGO, and at the end was offered a post by Sir Richard Woolley. He left to study for a Ph.D. at Rochester and returned to the RGO in 1970 as a research fellow. Paul and Louise shared an office located in one of the turrets of the castle. The constellation Cygnus, or the Swan, is a northern constellation on the plane of the Milky Way. Cygnus was among the 48 constellations listed by the 2nd century astronomer Ptolemy, and it remains one of the 88 modern constellations. Over 100 stars in Cygnus were observed to have planets by the Kepler satellite. Paul had been interested in celestial X-ray sources since he was a student, and in the late 60s, the X-rays emanating from the constellation Cygnus, discovered in 1964, caught his attention. At that time, the technology available could not pinpoint the source more accurately, but in 1970, data from the satellite Uhuru narrowed down the location of Cygnus X1. That is the first X-ray X-ray source in Cygnus, and narrowed it down to a few bright stars. More data started to point to the star HDE 226868 as the X-ray source. Meanwhile, Louise was investigating the velocities of the stars of the Milky Way and working on the Isaac Newton telescope and YAP telescopes. As will be said later, HDE 226868 is now known as Cygnus X1. Which is a binary star system consisting of a blue supergiant variable star and a smaller companion. It is about 7,200 light years away from Earth and is possibly 5 million years old. The Isaac Newton Optical Telescope was commissioned to celebrate the tercentenary of Isaac Newton's birth in 1643. The onset of World War II and many other difficulties delayed the plans, so it was not until Sir Richard Woolley arrived at Herstmonceux and reinvigorated the undertaking that the actual building of the telescope began. Even so, it was not until 1967 that Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth was invited to inaugurate the 90-inch Isaac Newton telescope. In an interview for the BBC Sky at Night magazine, Paul Murdin recalled how difficult he found it to work with. The astronomer was required to climb inside the telescope, and as its actual dimensions weren't very big, it was both difficult to operate and to get in and out of. Paul described the process as like being shoehorned into a fighter plane's cockpit. How Louise, who was taller than Paul, felt about the INT is not known, but we can surmise that she would have found it equally as challenging. You can see the people sort of squashed inside there. When the INT was commissioned, doubts had been raised as to the suitability of building such a large telescope in Sussex, the British weather cited as the primary drawback. In 1979, the telescope was dismantled and resited on La Palma, Canary Islands, where it is still in use today as part of the Isaac Newton group of telescopes. We'll go back now to Louise and Paul in their turret office. While in America, Paul had attempted to study the group of bright stars in Cygnus that had been shown to be an X-ray source, including HDE 226868, but without much luck. By the time Paul arrived back in Herstmonceux, the data was starting to point convincingly to HDE 226868 as the X-ray source. The INT that Louise was using was more powerful than the telescope Paul had used in the US to examine the star, and she was able to produce a better spectrum than he had. In August 71, they wrote the paper Optical Identification of Cygnus X1, identifying HGE 226868 as the Cygnus X1 X-ray source. It was published in the journal Nature in September that year. Further discussions between Louise and Paul, and more gathering of data by Louise, gave rise to their second paper, Cygnus X1, a spectroscopic binary with a heavy companion? Question mark. Louise and Paul's measurements and deliberations led them to the conclusions that HGE 226868 was a binary star, a blue supergiant orbiting a companion every 5.6 days, that the companion was the source of the high-energy X-rays, and that the mass of the companion probably being larger than about 2 solar masses, it is inevitable that we should also speculate that it might be a black hole. And they finished their paper that was published in January 1972 with that sentence. Louise and Paul's tentativeness is generally thought to be because the director Louise and Paul's tentativeness is generally thought to be because the director of RGO, Sir Richard Woolley, was concerned that if they were proved to be wrong, then that might reflect badly not only on the NGO, but also on the Admiralty, which had funded the observatory until 1964. Woolley was also sceptical about the existence of black holes, thinking them to be very exotic, and insisted on calling them black boxes. In his annual report for the Royal Greenwich Observatory in December 1971, Woolley records Louise and Paul's discovery of the X-ray source in Cygnus as Cygnus X1 and its mysterious companion, but he preferred another astronomer's explanation of the dipping of the X-ray beam as due to relativistic electrons, which produce inverse Compton X-rays from the B star's photons. This explanation actually supports Louise and Paul's speculation that the mysterious companion is a black hole, although it is unclear if that was understood at the time. In his A Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking recounts the tale of his 1975 bet with Kip Thorne, the then Professor of Theoretical Physics, California Institute of Technology, that Cygnus X1 did not contain a black hole. This despite the fact that Hawking had obviously read their paper and accepted Louise and Paul's observations and reasoning why Cygnus 1 had to be a black hole. Although he, like many others, does not mention them by name. A black hole seems to be the only really natural explanation of the observations, he said. However, Hawking claims he made the bet as a form of insurance policy. If black holes did not exist, then all his theoretical work on them would be wasted. But if he won the bet, then you'd have the consolation of receiving a 4-year subscription to Private Eye magazine, courtesy of Kip Thorne. Eventually, though, he conceded the bet and acknowledged that Kip Thorne and Louise and Paul were correct, because there is now so much other observational evidence in favour of black holes. One wonders what Louise and Murdin's reaction to the bet was and its concession. In his recollections for the Royal Observatory Greenwich website, Ian Glass, an infrared astronomer and colleague of Louise and Paul's, is less tentative in recording his memory of the first discovery of a black hole. He says, one of the most exciting and interesting discoveries made around that time at RGO was that by Louise Webster and Paul Murdin of a massive invisible object in the Cygnus X1 system from radio velocity observations of the B01b supergiant H.D. 226868. This was the first black hole to be identified in our galaxy. Not long after this momentous discovery of the first black hole, Louise was seconded to the Radcliffe Observatory, Pretoria, South Africa, to work as a principal scientific officer. From 1967, the Radcliffe had been leased by the Science Research Council, which also administered the RGO, and its observatory at the Cape of Good Hope. Astronomers from Herstmonceux were regularly seconded to the South African observatories. Louise had an adventurous streak, so she did not go by the direct route. As her sister-in-law said, she was game for anything. Louise would have first flown to Egypt, but from there she drove with RGO colleagues south to Pretoria, a journey of over 8,000 kilometres that probably took over a week. George Wilkins, superintendent of Her Majesty's National Almanac Office at Herstmonceux, wrote in his personal history of the RGO, Louise transferred to the Radcliffe Observatory via the Sahara in 1972. While in South Africa, among other projects, Louise collaborated with Ian Glass on the infrared photometry and Wolf-Rayet stars. She also wrote a paper entitled Observation of Stars Near X-ray Sources. It contained the results of a search for the optical counterparts of several southern X-ray sources. In 1974, the Radcliffe telescope, which you can see there in the background, was sold to the South African Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, and Louise was again seconded, but this time back to Australia, to Siding Springs, to work at the Anglo-Australian Telescope. Initially, she worked as an RGO commissioning astronomer, but later became a staff member, staying for a further 3 years. Louise's Ph.D. had been on planetary nebulae, and she continued to study them throughout her research career. At Siding Spring, as well as other papers, she wrote a paper on a planetary nebulae in the red globular cluster in the Large Magellanic Cloud, and in collaboration with fellow astronomers, a paper entitled The Planetary Nebula in the Fornax Dwarf Galaxy. And she co-edited with J.A.J. Wieland a user guide to the telescopic equipment of the Anglo-Australian Telescope. In 1978, Louise joined the staff of the School of Physics at the University of New South Wales as a tutor, and in late 1980 accepted a position as lecturer. In 1985, the Department of Astrophysics and Optics was created within the School of Physics, with the Professor of Experimental Physics, K.N.R. Taylor, as its head, and Louise, one of its senior lecturers. By 1987, Professor Taylor had handed over the running of the department to Professor J.W.V. Story, who remained in charge until 1989, when Louise was appointed head of the Department of Astrophysics and Optics, a position she held until her untimely death in 1991. In 1978 too, Louise married radio astronomer Tony Turtle, although she continued to work and publish under her maiden name, Webster. And in 1980 they had a son, Michael. Louise continued her research into planetary nebulae and abundance gradients, working both with departmental and international colleagues. She wrote on subjects including abundance gradients in galaxies in the Centaurus and Sculptor groups, low surface brightness galaxies, and planetary nebulae in the Large Magellanic Cloud. Her work was frequently cited by other astronomers. Louise maintained her association with Siding Spring and supplied the primary astronomical guidance for the automated patrol telescope, a project which opened in 1989. This achievement was due in no small part to Louise's tireless efforts to obtain funding, to clear bureaucratic hurdles, and to bring the project to fruition. The APT has been used to search for exoplanets, and in 2006, Professor Michael Ashby and his colleagues at the University of New South Wales used it when they discovered a significant K7V eclipsing binary system. Louise's teaching duties were important to her, as was the welfare of her students. She developed a popular fourth-year honours course in astronomy and a successful liberal arts early graduate level astronomy course. However, her teaching was not confined to astronomy students. Her family remembers Louise telling them that day she'd been lecturing to a room full of plumbers. The authors of Explorers of the Southern Sky, a principal reference work on the history of astronomy in Australia, paid tribute to Louise's legacy. And they say this: an important catalyst for the development of astronomy at UNSW was Louise Turtle Webster, formerly a graduate of Bart Bok at the Mount Stromlo Observatory, who later went to work in the US and at the Royal Greenwich Observatory. Appointed to UNSW in 1978, she enthused both undergraduate and graduate students about astronomy and astrophysics, and promoted the importance of teaching astronomy to undergraduates in other faculties. Her own research was directed principally towards the understanding of planetary nebulae, but she was also an effective publicist for many areas of astronomy in the wider community. Louise was also a valued member of a number of committees in the School of Physics and the university. And further afield, she served on the Council of the Astronomical Society of Australia and on committees for time allocation for Parkes, the Anglo-Australian Telescope, and Mount Stromlo. The ASA, the International Union, and the ANZAAS Centenary Conference in 1988 also benefited from her organisational expertise. Louise appreciated that in her work she stood, to use a phrase attributed to Isaac Newton, on the shoulders of giants. In May 1988, the Centenary Conference of the Australian and New Zealand Association for the Advancements of Science was held in Sydney. At Louise's suggestion, a session on the history of astronomy was included, and 8 eminent Australian astronomers were videoed presenting their perspectives on the subject. Louise's characteristic modesty kept her behind the cameras. In 1966, when the Astronomical Society of Australia was formed, Louise was one of 8 women invited to join. One of eight women out of 145 total. In 1973, the first woman, Beverly Wills, was elected as an ASA councillor. However, it wasn't until 14 years later, in 1989, that the second woman, Louise, a woman who had a distinguished career as an astronomer and educator, was elected to the council. The Bott Prize was first awarded by the ASA in 1989 for outstanding research in astronomy or a closely related field to an honours student or eligible master's student at an Australian university. It was instigated largely due to the efforts of Louise to honour Bart Bok and his wife Priscilla, both great encouragers of talented students, just as Louise herself was. By all accounts, Louise was a gentle and self-effacing woman, a person of the utmost integrity, always completely fair, and always dependable as a person of great common sense. Her friend and colleague, Paul Murdin, remembers her as a very quiet woman who was not very demonstrative and kept her feelings to herself. But he does recall that the closest I ever saw her was when in South Africa I was poking an ant-heap with a stick and watching the ants race about. She took the ant's interest to heart and told me off. Quite right. A Colin Ian Glass remembers Louise's mischievous side. He says, I used to use the library a lot. This was at Herstmonceux. Louise told me that she liked to come in the door and go immediately into the stacks, the aim being to see how long it took Joan Perry, the librarian, to succumb to her curiosity and come downstairs from her office on the balcony to see who had just come in. Louise was also adventurous, tenacious, determined, innovative, and diplomatic. She certainly dedicated her life to astronomy, but not exclusively or in a narrow way. Her sister-in-law remembers her ability to talk about anything. She enjoyed the theatre, and when Kenneth Hartley, another AGO colleague, came to the Anglo-Australian telescope for a short working visit in August 1978, he took the opportunity to meet up with Louise, and they saw a Noel Coward play in the Sydney Opera House. Kenneth concluded sadly, it was the last time I saw her. In the late 1980s, Louise developed liver disease. And in 1988, she was the 10th Australian recipient of a liver transplant. Although the transplant was a success, and she was able to return to her work as head of the Department of Astronomy and Optics, Louise later developed terminal cancer and died peacefully at home in Paddington on the 29th of September 1990 at the young age of 49. Her funeral took place on Friday the 5th of October at the Eastern Suburbs Crematorium, Sydney, and her ashes were interred in the family plot in the North Road Cemetery, Nailsworth, on the 13th of December 1990. In their obituary for Louise, John Story and Don Faulkner remembered that her strength, courage, and cheerfulness during the years of her illness had made a lasting impression on all who have known her. At no time were these qualities better shown than when she attended the dinners of the 2 international conferences held in Sydney during last July. Although the physical effort which her involvement required was obviously very great, throughout both occasions she was her usual cheerful self. It is a mark of the respect in which she was held that a great many of her Australian and overseas colleagues took the opportunity at the second conference of paying tribute to her work and to her life. Louise's legacy and influence extended beyond Australia to the whole of astronomy. For example, her paper, The Masses and Galactic Distribution of Southern Planetary Nebulae, was pioneering in its field. As noted above, many of her, as I've said before, many of Louise's research papers were cited by other astronomers in their work, and she herself was recognized as a trailblazer due to her big impact to astronomy publications. However, the immediate impact of what could be thought of as her greatest legacy, in close association with Paul Murdin, that is, the identification of Cygnus X1 as the first discovered black hole on the astronomical community, is difficult to assess. In the literature, the site Cygnus X1 is accepted as the first discovered black hole, but very often the co-discoverers are not acknowledged. As an example, on the public information page of the Isaac Newton Group of Telescopes website, we find this sentence: "The first ever observational evidence of the existence of a black hole is one of the most outstanding results obtained by the Isaac Newton telescope. No mention is made of its human operator." In 2009, the Astronomical Society of Australia, in recognition of this important and pioneering woman, inaugurated the Louise Webster Prize in her honour. This prize, which is awarded annually by the ASA, is given in recognition of outstanding research by a scientist early in their postdoctoral career, and consists of the Louise Webster Medal, featuring the Helix Nebula, together with an award of $2,500 and ASA membership for the following calendar year. John Story and Don Faulkner, Louise's colleagues, conclude their memoir of Louise with these words: "With the passing of Louise Turtle Webster, Australian astronomy has lost one of the most highly respected members of our community, an excellent astronomer, a valued colleague, and a greatly beloved friend. Louise was a true wilderness girl, highly educated, self-reliant, and more than able to fully participate in public life. She may have spent her working life away from Adelaide, but I hope you will agree that Louise Webster deserves to be a well-known daughter of Adelaide, South Australia." Thank you. I've just got a video of the Isaac Newton telescope.
The Royal Greenwich Observatory is certainly a place to do a lot of learning. And a major aid to discovering more about the universe is the new 98-inch telescope, recently inaugurated by the Queen and named the Sir Isaac Newton telescope after the inventor of this type of instrument. Costing about £1 million in all, the great new Eye on the Sky is the largest ever built in Western Europe and is all British in construction. The louvers protecting the Great Mirror move aside, for despite the great progress made in radio astronomy during recent years, there is still a considerable contribution to be made to the science by optical instruments. The stars still hold so many secrets. The Astronomer Royal, Sir Richard Woolley, took his place at the magnificent telescope, which, despite its 87 tons weight, smoothly scans the heavens, keeping pace with the passing universe. Britain now has another great aid to science that will speed mankind's quest for knowledge. Ada.
This weird Japanese trick shrinks your belly fast.
This is the gelatin recipe.
I can't see how to. There you go.
Thanks, Nicola. Finally got the green light on my little device here. Yes, Louise certainly had an outstanding impact on astronomy by her co-discovery of the first black hole. And it's certainly important to celebrate achievements like that for a local from Adelaide, making an impact on the world of physics. And I think we've got to, inside ASA, think about how we celebrate her and someone else who was, I think, also buried at Nailsworth Cemetery, Colin Gum, who we've heard about previously. Yeah. So we've had a number of Adelaideans, South Australians really punch well above their weight in international astronomy. Now, you've heard all about Louise Webster. Are there any questions out there in the audience? Okay, it all sounds very comprehensive there. Perhaps we'll leave questions for coffee and snacks afterwards, after the session. Nicola will be there to answer any questions, I'm sure. In the meantime, as is traditional, we offer a small token of thanks to Nicola for her work in summarising Louise Webster's career. What you see there is all Nicola's work in terms of researching Louise's life and her impact. While it's reported in other spheres, in bits and pieces, Nicola's done a great job in putting it all together in one presentation. So, ladies and gentlemen, can we please thank Nicola in the usual way. Yes, moving on, this session will eventually turn up on our